If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello, this is Dr. Adrienne Torres. I'm here again with Truth in My Days director John Torres for a discussion about another important topic. John, what are we going to be looking at today?
I think we will probably be looking at mathematical probability.
Mathematical probability? Why? Is this relevant?
It is indeed. Mathematical probability is actually used by both sides of apologetics. Skeptics use it to attack the reliability of the gospel books, the reliability of the resurrection. Apologists use mathematical probability to try to strengthen the case for Christianity, for the fulfillment of prophecies, and in such ways. And unfortunately, both sides are actually using it wrongly. It's perhaps not that surprising because mathematical probability and statistical analysis is not in the purview of biblical scholarship. It's not something you study in that field of training. So perhaps it's not surprising that they misuse it, but they do indeed misuse it.
Well, that sounds interesting. I hope you'll be talking about how people on both sides are misusing probability. But meanwhile, how do liberal skeptics use this to attack the reliability of the gospel books?
Sure, let's start with that. We will do both sides, but we'll start with the liberal skeptics. Let's hear it straight from the horse's mouth. Dr. Bart Ehrman, a well-known evangelical turned agnostic, who has now devoted himself to spending his time to persuading people that the case for Christ is bogus. He's written a lot of books on that. He's engaged in a lot of debates. He's got internet presence. So here he is presenting this particular challenge from probability against the reliability or the believability of the resurrection. It's from a debate he did with Dr. Mike Licona, who was defending the Christian side.
This is the start of the recording from the YouTube video.
To the real problem of why historians cannot prove the resurrection. And this is what I want to spend my last 3.5 minutes on, the real problem. Mike and I agree that what historians try to do is establish what most probably happened in the past. That is the task of history. You can't prove the past. You can only give evidence for the past. And some evidence is more certain than other evidence. All the historian can do is show most probably what happened. What are miracles? Miracles, by definition, are the least probable occurrence of an event. If a miracle was not least probable, it wouldn't be a miracle. If somebody could walk across your lukewarm water in your swimming pool, that would be a miracle. If the water was frozen, it would not be a miracle. But if it's lukewarm, I can tell you, none of you here could do it, and nobody in this world could do it. That's 6 billion people, so what are the chances of one person being able to do it? It would defy the way nature naturally works. I'm not saying that there are natural laws that are written down someplace that you can't break or you get in big trouble. Scientists today don't talk about natural laws, but scientists do talk about highly predictable ways that this world works. And one of the way it works is that if you are a sentient human being trying to walk across the lukewarm water in your swimming pool, you won't be able to do it. What if somebody could do it? What would be the chances? The chances would be infinitesimally remote that anybody could do it. Well, what if somebody could? Okay, let's say somebody could. The chances of them being able to do it are infinitesimally remote. Can you prove that this person probably did it? No, you can't prove it because you can't repeat the experiment of the past to show he did it. That's the problem with history. It's not like the natural sciences. The natural sciences work by repeated demonstration. And so, for example, if I wanted to show you that bars of iron will sink in that swimming pool and bars of ivory soap will float, all I need to do is to get 100 bars of both and start chucking them in. I'll chuck in 100 bars of iron, they'll sink every time. I'll chuck in the soap, they'll float every time. that gives us a predictive probability of what will happen the 101st time. That's how sciences work, by repeated experimentation. Historians don't have that luxury. Historians can only establish on the basis of surviving evidence what probably happened in the past, and by definition, miracles are the least probable occurrence, or else they're not a miracle. This creates the dilemma for the historian and is the reason why historians cannot prove Jesus was raised from the dead. Historians, by their very nature, establish what most probably happened in the past, but a miracle, by its definition, is the least probable occurrence in the past. The least probable occurrence cannot be most probable. This is the problem with the resurrection. Even if it happened, it defies imagination and cannot be accepted as a historically proven event. Belief in the resurrection. If you believe in the resurrection, it is for theological reasons. The resurrection is a theological assertion about what God did to Jesus. It is not, and it cannot be, based on historical proof.
This is the end of the recording from the YouTube video.
So, what did you think of Armin's arguments, Dr. Torres?
Well, first of all, when he says this is the definition of miracle, I'm wondering whose definition is it? Did he just make up the definition? Because to me, a miracle would be something that is impossible, not just low probability, but impossible to do while abiding by the natural laws of science.
That is how we would define miracle. A miracle takes place when God intervenes to do something directly. It often does involve overriding natural laws, perhaps usually. Now, not necessarily always, perhaps sometimes not in a visible way. For example, suppose you are diagnosed with a terrible disease, a terminal disease, and you pray to God, you ask for healing, and then you find out they made a mistake in your test, you don't have the disease. Well, did they really make a mistake in your test? Or in fact, did God intervene at that point to heal you? So I think he does do miracles that are sometimes, perhaps often, not so obvious as the miracles that he does in the Bible. But yes, it's God directly intervening, and if you look at the resurrection, for example, certainly that's scientifically impossible, and that's why it's such good proof. Even in those days, where science was not as advanced as it is now, people knew that the dead don't come back to life. They were very familiar with death, probably more so than most of us are, but they knew people didn't come back from the dead. So Jesus' proof that he kept pointing to, for the truth of what he's saying, that he would come back from the dead, was very telling. The other kinds of miracles he did, healing a man born blind, as that man said in John chapter 9, that from the beginning of the world, it's unheard of that anybody should open the eyes of one born blind. So yes, miracles are God's direct intervention in the affairs of human history in a particular situation, where often it does involve setting aside laws of nature.
So are you saying it doesn't have to set aside laws of nature? Because about man born blind, now we can often correct whatever it was. If it is someone born with a congenital cataract, then the child's born blind, but now we can replace it. And maybe 2,000 years ago we couldn't. So what I mean is a miracle, does it then have to defy the laws of science? Or just because we have no technology, with no knowledge of the science, and nobody could do it at that time, yet it happened?
We can certainly deal with some conditions of blindness that we couldn't deal with before. Congenital cataract, as you suggest, that's one of them. This, in fact, is very interesting because this is how we discovered a condition that the best medical minds hadn't anticipated, something that's called post-blind syndrome. And explains that very interesting account in Mark chapter 8, 22 to 25, where a blind man comes to Jesus and Jesus heals him. And he asks him, what do you see? He says, I see men like trees walking. And Jesus touches him again, and then he sees all things clearly. And this confused people for a very long time, wondering why did Jesus have to do it twice? Why did he have to touch him twice? Why did it seem that the first time it didn't quite take, and he had to do it again? And through the centuries, all kinds of theological interpretations were spun on this, object lessons Jesus was trying to teach. And it was not until the second half of the 20th century that when we were able to heal certain conditions of blindness, that we discovered something that we had not anticipated. We assumed to that point that if a person is blind, his eyes don't work properly, and so all we have to do is fix the eye and it'll work properly. What we didn't realize is that if a person is blind, he's born blind, he's been blind for a long time, he has two problems if the eyes don't work. The visual cortex of the brain, which interprets the visual data, also stops working properly. Apparently, the body doesn't like to waste energy maintaining systems that aren't used, and that part of the brain is not being used, and so it atrophies, shrivels, something like that. It doesn't work properly. And they found, in this case, where they healed certain conditions of blindness, the people could see, but their minds, their brains could not properly interpret the visual data they were getting. They would see parts of something, they would see things blurring together, they couldn't separate or distinguish between the images. And they worked hard on therapy trying to get this fixed. And there's an interesting case told by Dr. Oliver Sacks, who was dealing with a patient such as this. His name was Virgil. And Virgil was a victim of post-blind syndrome. And he was out one day, and apparently there was a grove of trees, and some people came walking past the trees. And he couldn't distinguish visual data properly. And Dr. Sacks asked him, "What do you see?" He said, "I see men like trees walking." Because he couldn't separate out the image of the trees, the image of the men. They blurred together into one. And Sacks went, "Wait, I'd read something like that before." And there was it in Mark. And he realized this is what happened. The man who was blind had post-blind syndrome after his eyes were fixed. The first act Jesus did, obviously, was to fix the eyes. The second act then was to fix the visual cortex. Normally, Jesus did that all in one fell swoop, and he can do that. But at this one time, he did it in two steps. So it's recorded that way so that we, reading it almost 2,000 years later, know that a miracle happened there. We know that a miracle happened there because this is a condition we did not anticipate. We didn't know it was there until we were able to heal these conditions of blindness. So how could a person in the first century describe essentially a clinically perfect description of post-blind syndrome in front of him unless that's what he really saw? But he could really see that only if Jesus actually did perform that miracle of healing. So yes, it's not just a matter, as our technology increases, we can certainly emulate some miracles, and then they become not miracles anymore, but others not. Starting with the first one, the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, a violation of the first law of thermodynamics. Matter, energy cannot be created or destroyed by any natural process, but only change from one form to another. That's something we'll never be able to emulate, no matter how good our technology becomes. Second law of thermodynamics, where God shapes this form, without form and void material he'd made as the first act of creation. He shapes it into the elements of the universe in complete violation of the second law of thermodynamics, which is the most certain law in all of science. We're never going to be able to emulate that. So I'd say, yeah, in generally, certainly the impressive miracles, these are violations of laws of science, and by all natural means, they're absolutely impossible.
Okay, I get that. But I'm not sure how Armin plans to use probability to disprove Jesus' resurrection. Is he just going to say it is such low probability, so it didn't happen?
Well, this is the problem. Historians, he says, that historians try to establish the most probable event, most probable, probably what happened in the past, that there's no way to be certain of it. You can only establish probabilities. And he says, Mike and I agree on that. And indeed, Lacona does. Christian philosophers like William Lane Craig agree on this, that the historian can never be sure of anything from the past. He can only talk about what probably happened.
What if the historian's an eyewitness?
Well, then he wouldn't be a historian, would he? He'd be
Well,
an
he was
eyewitness.
writing his memoir or whatever, and then he saw what happened. That would be a historian who can be totally sure what he saw.
Well, I would think so, but again, here's where philosophy mucks up the works, because they will tell you, no, you can't ever be totally sure, and so you can only deal with probability.
Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but please join us for the next part tomorrow. Same time and same place. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to share any questions or comments you may have. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, MeWe, and YouTube. Simply search Truth in My Days as one word,